All right, our next speaker is a social science researcher and business consultant. He has served as president of Atheist Alliance International from 2008 to 2010, which is where I met him, and he currently serves as development director for the Institute of Humanist Studies in the United States. He's spoken at a number of international conferences, including the 30th Annual World Religions Conference in Waterloo, Ontario, and he lives in Los Angeles, California. I'm happy to say that I consider him a friend, and it's my pleasure to introduce Stuart Bechman. Stuart.
Thank you. Okay, and oh good, I can hear myself, great. This is a great conference this weekend. The weather is great. I have to say, every conference I've been to, and I've been to dozens of them, every one is just awesome weather. I don't know what that is. You'd think if there's an issue there with God being concerned about atheists like us mixed, what a better place to teach us a lesson, right? But I don't know. 2 weeks ago, I was in Iowa for an atheist convention speaking there, and I'm presuming you guys have heard of all the tornadoes and the floods and all that been going on in southern United States, and I'm thinking, wow, God's got such a lousy aim, yeah? I don't know. So, glad to be here. The European Enlightenment is something that is near and dear to me. I'm a bit of a history buff, and knowing the roots of where we're coming from, where we are, has always been an important adventure journey for me. So I was hoping to share that with you today because, you know, the religious traditions, of course, they have their founding stories, don't they? You have the Jews leaving out of Egypt. You've got the Christians have their own passion story, and atheists and secularists have our own founding story. And better yet, ours is true. And it is as amazing as it is true. So that's what I'm going to cover today, and I hope you're going to enjoy this. But let's start with what life was before the Enlightenment. Medieval Europe, we're talking, 1600s, 1500s, What was that like? Well, war, disease, starvation, injustice were pretty stable fixtures out there. Permanent. People saw that was just part of life. Not a lot of change in any control of that at all. Just you got what you wanted. You got what came your way, and that was it. Over half of all children at the time die in childhood. Many at birth, and many take their moms with them. So it was a very traumatic experience to have children at that time. Those that actually survived to adulthood were usually maimed by other diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis or consumption or even malnutrition. So you kind of had a civilization, a society of, I guess you'd say, walking wounded out there, if you want to think of it that way. And they had doctors in those days, but you had a better chance to survive if you didn't go see one than if you did. This was a time when kings ruled by divine right. That was their established hierarchy, and they pointed to the Bible and the church to justify their spot. And things like lightning were considered divine retribution, as I was just referring to a few minutes ago. In fact, if lightning struck a house in a village, most villages, it was illegal to put that fire out because you were thwarting God's will. So lightning was basically carrying out what the guy had done. So what would happen would be, instead of worrying about putting out the fire, people would be talking about, "Ooh, what did he do? He must have been really bad. Ooh, look at that," So very strange society, very, very, very pessimistic society. Well, okay, so how did we get to that point? I'm going to take us a little further here. Roman civilization, of course, Western Europe, all came out of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was, in a lot of ways, pretty impressive. They did a lot of building. They put in roads, they put in water mills, they put in viaducts, aqueducts. They had Greek philosophers, and it just kept going and going and going for hundreds of years. And that's what was inherited in Western Europe after the fall of Roman civilization. But you know, most Europeans didn't even realize the Roman civilization had collapsed, because they had the Bible, they had the book of Revelations in the Bible, and the book of Revelation said that there would be 4 empires that passed before Christ returned on earth. And they knew that there had been 4 empires, and they were still there. So Christ hadn't returned yet, so therefore we must still be in the Roman Empire. Yeah, that's it. So, but after the empire collapsed, was taken over by Visigoths, and barbarians moved in, Christianity kind of took over the role of the state and began promoting the clergy and promoting that. And a lot of the knowledge of the time in the Roman era was lost because people would go around, I mean, papyrus and sheepskin were rare enough. So what people would do, rather than going and producing more because they lost the capacity to manufacture things, they would go and collect old manuscripts, old texts, scrape them off, and turn them into prayer books or song books for church. You know, very much of an emphasis on piety, but in so doing, we lost thousands, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that could have survived today if that hadn't happened. So it was a time when worldly wisdom was disappearing. We had forgetting everything that preceded that. It was a time of piety, and mysticism. And so much of that knowledge over the period was lost. The mood became much more pessimistic. There was nothing we could do. Very fatalistic time at that. And of course, what we call today the Dark Ages. And there's a very good reason for that. A time of rise of asceticism, of mysticism, loss of self-confidence, a hope in this life. And really, you were counting on, you know, life was pretty miserable. So all you really had to hope on to was what life was going to be after I died, and how good it was going to be, as the church kept promising us. But the life here, really rough. There were cycles of starvation, death going on, climate variation, overpopulation. So the feast-famine thing was a pretty common persistence there. Europeans were told they were bad and corrupt because of original sin, and there was nothing we could do to be redeemed except for God's grace. You know, so this pessimism led to a bit of a paralysis, social and cultural development. Nothing really changed for hundreds of years. And a fear of change actually spread, and a lot of people at the time were, even if you could change something, I wouldn't, because it's only going to be worse than what I have here now. And I heard someone describe that period, the Christian era that we're talking about here, it really was described as a cultural failure of nerve, I guess I'd say. Not a lot of hope, not a lot of optimism, not a lot of looking forward to what could be, but mainly enduring what you have now. Social stratification, well, that was well in place by the Roman era, and the Christian era simply expanded it and entrenched it further. We had royalty and clergy and nobles at the top, merchants, artisans in the middle, and everybody else at the bottom. That time, that period, the church, of course, was playing a part in that because they got to make the rules. They were the official religion of the empire, so of course, when you get to make the rules, you make sure that your group is on top. So we saw wealth and power just getting worse and worse over the decades, and everybody else, well, not so much. But like I said, the church took care of their own. So by the Middle Ages, the church was one of the largest and most wealthiest landowners in the entire continent of Europe. Had its own armies, had its own serfs, slaves, if you will. But the church was active. It was involved in the community. And because of its position, it worked regularly to promote that. And so it had outreach programs. It generally looked for designated heretics, hunted them down, allowed rumors of witches and spiritual demons to rumors to pass around to fund witch hunts, which caused the deaths of tens of thousands of women and elderly people during that time. Meanwhile, the church had very few qualms about co-opting other superstitious practices of its own. In time, mystics, astrologers, they were regular fixtures, not just in the courts, but in the papacy and in the bishoprics there. So there was all this superstition, all this hierarchy, stratification going on, and that was the way life was prior to the Enlightenment. Well, by the 1300s, people were pretty fed up. Plague had gone through at that point. There was well-known endemic corruption on all levels, and we started hearing rumblings for the first time in the Italian Renaissance that came up. So this started about 1300, and depending how you look at history, this went on about 300, 350 years. So we're going to talk about this briefly here, catch us up, because the Enlightenment follows the Renaissance period. But the Renaissance was not a period of looking to transform the society or lead to a new world, but basically it was looking backwards. It was looking to recapture the wisdom of the ancients that had been lost. By this time, there had been enough scholars and wealthy merchants in Italy that they had gone back over the spice trade back to China. They knew of other civilizations, and they had known that there were earlier civilizations that seemed to have all the answers that we didn't have. So the Italian Renaissance was a push to help recapture that, maybe find out what did the Greeks know, what did the Romans know that we've forgotten about, or that we've changed, or that we've corrupted. So they went back to Greece, they went back to what's now Turkey, Constantinople, and started researching and collecting old texts. They were in monasteries and in mountains around the country, and started collecting them, started translating them. They taught themselves how to read Greek and Roman, Greek and Hebrew texts, so they could get back to the original source of what was said back then. And that opened a lot of amazing discoveries that they had not expected. Art flourished at that time. This is the period of Leonardo da Vinci, of Rodin. Humanistic art flourished in that time. Again, kind of reflecting back on the classical Greco-Roman times when realistic art was much more in vogue than what we saw in the Middle Ages. And of course, the Protestant Reformation, 1517, the 95 Theses in Germany, kicked off about 100 years of religious wars in Europe, fighting over the Protestants versus the Catholics. So I'm going through the periods here pretty quickly. We're now getting close to about 1600 or so. And about near the end of this time, there are two people that are important to us that arise in history. And these people, they're notable because they provide a new way of thinking about where do we get truth from? How do we know what's true and what's not? I mean, up to this point, the worldview had simply been Aristotle painted this earth-centric universe. Everything was fixed forever out in the cosmos. Where here down on the earth, we were corrupt, we decayed, we died, but the world out there, the universe out there was perfect, was where God lived and never changed. But this was all by authority. So when people had a question of, well, how come we had a flood in town last week? Well, we go back to Aristotle and find out what we knew there, and then we deduce from that, how could God be taking his retribution out on us here for the flood last week? These people changed that. First one I want to bring up is René Descartes. Do we know who René is? We know, I think, therefore I am. That's the famous guy there. That's what the phrase is, but what it stands for is a stance in seeking truth through rationalism. Rene, who was a mathematician and touched a lot of other areas at the time, really his philosophy was thinking, what can we trust? And the I think, therefore I exist came about because the only thing we can trust is we know that we are thinking. And what does it mean if I'm thinking? Well, the only thing I can really conclude of that is that someone's doing that thinking. It must be me or somebody, so whoever's doing that thinking must exist. So that's the basis. That was the core basis of him creating a whole new philosophy that based around mathematics and concepts and reason as opposed to authority. This was a really, really big deal at the time. Well, it still is, I guess. The other fellow I want to bring up is Francis Bacon. Englishman. He's known, not for his trend-setting fashions necessarily, but he rejected the value of authority as a source of knowledge and instead laid out a new method for acquiring knowledge through his book, the Novus Organum. And I may be mispronouncing that. I don't speak Latin, so I read more than I speak these things. But this was a key manuscript, this was a key publication that laid out, instead of going to authority and deducing what all the secrets of what that new knowledge was or what that old knowledge was, he turned it around and said, okay, we're going to start instead with specifics. Okay, we had a flood here this week, we had a flood here last year, we had a flood here 5 years ago. Can we draw any general conclusions about that? Well, maybe there's a floodplain there. New information that Aristotle didn't know, but based on our collection of facts, we now have a new theory that we can actually then turn back and say, okay, why don't we watch that and see if more flooding happens over the next 10 years? And this was absolutely revolutionary. And you and I, in the world that we live in, we think about things this way all the time, maybe not so formalized, but it was just unheard of at that time. Francis Bacon, and this work he did, is what laid the groundwork with what Rene Descartes also did, laid the foundation for what was going to happen following the Renaissance. I mean, these thinkers redefined not only how we discover truth in the world, they actually knocked a fatal chunk in the status quo, and in that way laid the groundwork for revolution. There's another fellow at this time, near the end of the Renaissance, Galileo. Now, he isn't the entire scientific revolution, but he's a major representative of that because he had his hand in so many things. He was an inventor. We know that it was his creation of a telescope, pointing it up into the sky and realizing that the eternal fixtures of the sky were not as fixed as we understood, was kind of laid the final blow to that earth-centered perspective of what the universe was like. And this unleashed a whole flood of research, new tools on the nature of the universe. What is this place we live in? How can we learn more about it? So he touched all sorts of areas. He touched astronomy, physics, mechanics, chemistry, agricultural science, medicine, and math. So in a lot of ways, he really was the epitome of what the scientific revolution accomplished and how it changed the world. But all that work was only the start here. What followed here was even more amazing, and that is Isaac Newton shows up on the scene. All these people are incredibly pious. These are not people looking to bash God. Isaac Newton was pious all his life for all his brilliance. When he was on his deathbed and his confidants gathered around him and said, you know, we're going to miss you so much. What do you think is the most significant accomplishment you did in your life? And he was like 84, 85 years old at this time, laying on his deathbed. So he had a lot of time a lot of history to look back on what he'd done. And he said, the most important thing I think I accomplished in my life is I am dying a virgin. So those are his priorities, okay? Fortunately, he did other things that we appreciate a lot more. he developed differential calculus, was able to actually merge and intersect algebra with geometry in ways that we could never measure before this. And, of course, Newton's 3 laws of motion, which transformed, again, how we measured the world, what it all stood for. And more than that, these laws indicated that the world was predictable and understandable. It was not just whim and fickle. It wasn't just God looking over to see who he's going to smite next. There are actual formulas out there that we can see how the world works based on this. This was incredibly big. Again, we don't know this, we don't appreciate this these days, we take it for granted. Well, of course, gravity is there, and of course, we have math to figure out things, but these were not well-known concepts at the time, and these were just huge. All right, so by this time, we had made massive improvements, massive mastery of the world that we had lived in. We knew that there was a floodplain here. We built a little dam, able to protect the town from the flood. We were actually able to use things like steam engine and horsepower to accomplish things we hadn't done before. We can start to modify the world around us. And we'd never done that before, at least during the Christian era. Okay, so those were big. So we had gotten that far. The next step really wasn't all that big, and that is, if we can control the environment, can we control society? Can we create a better society than what we have now? I mean, we look around, we see corruption everywhere we go, we see, a few handfuls of very wealthy and powerful people running the show everywhere. Everyone else is just basically surviving day to day, little better than animals and sometimes slaves. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. And people started to think, does it have to be that way? Now, those daring thinkers, I'm going to introduce you here, became known as the Philosophes. And these guys became the first social engineers. And here's where our story really applies to us. So, these guys are the ones that dared to believe society doesn't have to be this way. We've learned other things about the world that we never knew hundreds of years ago. Perhaps we can learn how to make a better society. And so they start talking about this, start writing to each other, they started writing to prominent people, looking for sponsors to help talk about the concepts here that they were talking about. And to do that, they went back to the myth of Prometheus. Do you know what the myth of Prometheus is? Prometheus was a human being in classical Greek times who actually had the audacity to go to Mount Olympus, climb up, steal fire from the gods and bring it back to humanity. And of course, the gods were furious, couldn't believe the arrogance of a human being to take such a divine tool away from them. And so they punished him by capturing him, by cutting open his bowels, and lashing him to a cliff where a large bird would come every day and it would consume his liver. And then every night the liver would grow back. Next day the bird would come, eat the liver again, and just an endless cycle of torture and punishment for what the gods considered was extreme hubris for that. And the Christian interpretation of this myth was fine with this. I mean, it emphasized the futility and danger of human effort and accomplishment. Human beings, the church told us, should be humble, meek, obedient to authority. Otherwise, you're going to end up like Prometheus. Our Philosophes, though, saw this sort of differently. Rather than focusing on the eternal torture of Prometheus, they turned it and reinterpreted it as a proud symbol of knowledge and how knowledge can equate to power, and pointed to the courage and innovation and the noble life that Prometheus led that forever transformed the world for the better. I mean, these guys were like, this isn't an awful story. This is a story of power and courage, optimism. We can do this too. So we talked about the Christian era being something like a culture of failure of nerve. This was the start of creating a new culture of the recovery of nerve. So that's what another way I would call the Enlightenment is having the audacity, having the boldness to dare to see if we can change things and make things for the better. So at this time, we had these amazing advances through the scientific revolutions. At this point, Europe, all the old structures, they were stratified, they were straining under these paradigms. Religious wars had been ravaging the continent for decades. And the old system of guilds, the rules of warfare, all this was decaying. So the Philosophes said the time is right. The time is really right for a new program of reform and even revolution. The Philosophes saw this program as a science of freedom, of empowerment. What can you and you and you get out of this life? What can you and you and you accomplish? Are things set from birth, or can we change things? So the Philosophes sought to clear all the errors and all the fictions of the past that had been imposed upon the populace. They saw much of institutions like the state and the church basically spreading lies that nothing can change. And they wanted to discover instead the true mechanisms and laws beneath society that would allow all people to be free to develop their own potential. And from those results, they would build nothing less than a new, flourishing, prosperous society for all to go, well, in a more colloquial term, where no man has gone before. So, how did they do this? Their program consisted of 9 areas or values that they addressed in the program. And I'm going to go through these now very quickly here, just so you can see a little detail to how this went about. First one was empiricism. They went back to Descartes and Bacon and said, we have objective ways of knowing what's true and what's not. And anything else that claims to be true, we should throw out. This was the start of skepticism. They wanted to strip away the fictions. They zealously questioned most claims of authority, ridiculed them actually if they couldn't be verified. They demanded verifiable evidence for all claims and denounced unjustified claims as illegitimate. So empiricism. Next was optimism, or what we might hear today as modernism. A hope, a belief that things can improve over time. Up to this point, the word innovation was a slur. Oh, he's being innovative. Not good. The Philosophes, the Enlighteners that we listed here, they said, no, innovation is very good. In fact, the thing we need to worry about is continued stagnation, because look where it's gotten us so far. Innovation is something we should strive to try. We'll never know if we can reach there unless we try. But we think there's a better future out there, and we should be excited about it. We should be looking for it. We should be seeking it out to make a better world for ourselves and our progeny. Okay, how do we do that? Well, at this point, it was very much a nanny society, right? I mean, we had the church, we had the state saying, you have your place, we'll tell you what to do, you just be nice and quiet. No, the Philosophes were, we can do this ourselves. This is very much a democratic approach. So empowerment, they pushed ideas of social sciences, psychology, sociology, political economy. They wanted to actually create sciences about mankind that we could learn about. And they pushed education, universal education for all, well, at that time, all propertied white men, but it got bigger. So, educational institutions, so we would have the power as individuals to make a difference out there. Without the knowledge, or with the knowledge, we would have the power to change. My favorite value here is secularism, of course. They, of course, recognize the Christian church as a major institution of not just graft, but oppression and illegitimacy of ecclesiastical authority. They saw all that, and they realized that that was a real problem. That was a really structural problem in the society they needed to root out. So mocking the church, ridiculing them as much as they could, was a regular part of the Philosophes program. If you were in Catholic countries, you were ridiculing the clerics and the corruption of the priests. If you were in Protestant countries, you were more questioning about diversity and whether there can be only one set doctrine and whether people can be held to it, or whether there should be more of a tolerance and a diversity of different ways of looking at religious belief. And underneath all that, there was a development of what we now call deism, which was kind of a synchronizing or syncretism of God and nature being one, and that this God and nature isn't fickle and just sitting in his throne in the sky, but he actually follows natural laws, and that if we know what those natural laws are, then that's what we know of God. So they rejected any sort of revelatory texts, any sort of prophets that came out and said, this is what God really wants. And they said, no, whatever there is out there, whatever kind of God or divine being or divine purpose in the world, it's something we can understand, it's something natural, and the better we understand it, the better off we'll be. Equality. I did say that education was for all white men at the time and lasted that way for a long time. Slavery was endemic and entrenched, and the place of women in society was endemic and entrenched. So while they didn't implement what we would think today as a universal program of equality, it was the first time they thought about it, because they realized as they had all these principles of empowerment and each of us have equal worth, well, eventually you had to look at the female gender. Eventually you had to look at the darker races that we were enslaving and saying, why would they be treated differently than us men? So it didn't end the conversation, it started the conversation at that point. This one kind of surprised me when I was researching all this. But I guess it makes sense, because manners and politeness became a very big part of the Enlightenment program. Now, what you're thinking, what is that about? You know, be nice to people? That sounds a little fuzzy, and what difference could that make? But we go back to the screen where we talked about social stratification. And the social stratification time was very much more like what you would see maybe in India's caste system, or if you've read Charles Dickens' novels, or if you know anything about the Jim Crow era in the southern United States, you get a much better idea of what stratification meant. Because if you were someone above the fellow down the street or next to you, you could treat him like dirt, and that was your right. It had no consequence for you. However, that person, regardless how you treated him, still deserved deference and respect for your position in society. And if they didn't do that, and you roughed him up a bit, I don't know, maybe killed him, oh well, but he didn't know his place. This was pretty well established at the time. And the Philosophes looked at this and says, you know, the fellow down the street is no different than the king sitting in the castle. And one of the things we need to do to implement this value is to talk about polite. Now, how many people, we're in Canada, you guys are really polite people, not like us ruffian Americans, but you know, you go back to English society where, you know, it's kind of a stereotype that the British are very polite, and it's not just happenstance. It's something that was actually actively, consciously promoted during the Enlightenment period. Oh, and I'm going to go back and say, this has an extension. Not only is it good for society to be kind to each other, to be civil to each other, but wrapped around this is also a tolerance for diversity. So if I'm a Calvinist and you're a Lutheran, this value of manners and politeness extends to, well, give him the right to think the way he wants, as long as you give me the right to think I want. And again, this was a very foreign, alien concept up to this point. But tolerance of diversity grew out of this. Well, you get all these pieces together, and you take it to the logical conclusion, and you realize we're talking about democratic institutions. Up to this point, the social dynamic, the social theory was that general populations needed a great leader or a sovereign to keep us in check and to keep us from lurching towards anarchy. And the Philosophes said, no, if you have the values of empowerment, of education, of kindness, of all these other things we've been talking about, then our society doesn't need a great leader. Our society doesn't need a sovereign. We can actually build and maintain a society based on an agreed-to social contract with all of you, all of me. Come in and decide who's going to be our leader. It's not going to be God. It's not going to be the church. It's not going to be the king's oldest son necessarily. The Philosophes said we can do this differently by saying we can choose our own leaders and have an active voice in our government. Again, revolutionary, heretical. Liberty. You put all these things together, and you're developing, as I said, people who are free, people who are willing, who are able to fulfill and do as much, have the capacity and will to be everything they can be, in the words of the U.S. military. And the Philosophes really felt, whereas up to that point, liberty was a very scary word to most authority at the time, but to the Philosophes, to the Enlighteners, liberty was the place to err on over order. If there was a decision to be made, we will survive as a society with more liberty rather than less. And then finally, freedom here. Well, that's what we're all focusing on with this program. It's more a goal than a value, but if you have all those other 8 pieces in there, the result's going to be a free society where individuals will be free to seek maximum fulfillment and enjoyment in their lives. The Philosophes program used all these values here to dare to envision a new society, to dare to envision a kinder, gentler society, and a more empowered and fulfilling society for all human beings, not just the wealthy, the powerful, the privileged. And that is what the Enlightenment program, its legacy, was in what it carried forward to this day. Now, what was the culmination of all these efforts? Well, this was about 100 years from the time of Newton, Voltaire, to having David Hume, John Locke, all the other people we list here, Ben Franklin. The culmination of this happened late in the 18th century with the American colonies drafting and signing a Declaration of Independence based on many of the Enlightenment values. And deliberately so. Thomas Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, they were all very well-studied students on this. Not only the Declaration of Independence, but 11 years later with the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, where many of these values and rights were enshrined in that document. This was not just a revolution based on alleged tyrannies of the British king or other injustices imposed on the American people. You can look back now and see that the American Revolution was ignited as much by the Enlightenment and the intellectuals behind that as any of the political dynamics going on in Virginia or Massachusetts or New York. Well, the Enlightened community, they just reveled in the independence of the United States and the success, apparently, and how bloodless it was, how prosperous suddenly this new country had been created out of all these great Enlightenment values, and it raged a firestorm around the world. Everywhere else, where can we get some more of this democracy? This is a whole new way of living. We need to have this. So revolutions started popping up everywhere. And of course, if you know your history, you know what these are. France, of course, just a few years later with the French Revolution. Haiti, Mexico even, Ireland, Poland, Lithuania adopted a new Enlightenment constitution just a few years later. Central America, South America, Germany, Central Europe. Revolutions started spreading all over after seeing the success of the colonies. But at the same time, unlike the United States, these other efforts were much better resisted and countered by anti-reform forces who took as many lessons as the rest of us did from the success in North America. So in very short time, all these revolutions were put back down. And it took another 150 years, really, before many of these Enlightenment values were adopted in much of the rest of the world. And then they were often won only by civil or world wars. I mean, the lines were drawn after the United States was created, and it became a battle between the traditionalists and the reformers everywhere around the world over 150 years. And even when it was successful, there was constant backsliding. And the struggle continues today in many parts of the world. And even today, we know that even in places where the battle was successful, that success isn't secure. There are constantly and perpetually anti-Enlightenment forces who continue to push back and struggle to erode and undercut those values wherever and whenever they can. And what was heard in the early days of the American Republic? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I think that's quite the true statement. So with this, I finished my tour of the Enlightenment and the history that has preceded us here in this room today. I hope and urge that you hold that heritage proud and high as you remember where it and where we all came from. Thank you.